One could argue that Zionism began in AD 130, following the complete expulsion of all Jews from Palestine after their failed uprising and revolt against Rome. Since then, the Jews have sought to regain an independent state in the Holy Land and rebuild their temple, which the Romans had demolished in AD 70. However, their power was never sufficient to allow for this, and it took many centuries for them to build up enough influence to enable any possibility of such an idea. The diaspora forced the Jews into neighboring regions, remaining mostly within the Roman Empire, where they would be a minority. The Romans had no incentive to treat them as ordinary citizens, given the fact that they had revolted twice in 60 years, disrupting the peace and costing Rome huge amounts in human and material resources. Restrictions were placed on the Jews for this reason. It's important to note that throughout history, Jews have typically existed as a small minority of around 2 to 3% in all countries they've resided in. One reason for this is conversion out of Judaism, usually becoming either Muslim or Christian. Thus, over the centuries, a majority of Jews actually fully assimilated and melted into their host country, becoming full citizens. This explains why Jews have remained low in number throughout Christendom and the Muslim world. The lack of acceptance and suspicion of the Jews by the native populations only helped to keep the dream alive of re-establishing a Jewish state. However, this dream would be dormant for hundreds of years, as it was simply an impossibility, certainly with empires whose ruling class was unsympathetic to their aspirations. The Holy Land passed from the Romans to the Byzantines and on to the Ottomans, under whose rule it would remain until 1918, when it was conceded to the British at the conclusion of the First World War. The Jews needed external assistance if they were to have any chance of reclaiming what they believed to be their land. An opportunity began to present itself after the Reformation, when various rebellions against the Vatican started to emerge, resulting in the Protestant movement, causing a rift to appear across Europe. With much of Christendom excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, chiefly northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, the populations were able to read the Bible in their local languages and were no longer prohibited from Bible ownership. With interpretation of scriptures no longer safeguarded by the Church, individuals were able to apply their own exegesis according to their subjective understanding of the Bible. This was incredibly dangerous and something the Church had warned about. Inevitably, new interpretations began to surface, as there was no longer any centrality to the Church, and any person could essentially become his own bishop or pope. Biblical revisionism became rife, and new denominations began to appear as charismatic individuals were able to build followings, leading to various cults and sects, something that continues to this day. The Bible, taken out of the Church, becomes a manifesto for revolution, and the Jews seized on this. Protestantism is Judaized Christianity, and many of the new sects began to see the Jews differently. With more eyes on the Bible, many new interpretations emerged, including that the Jews were the descendants of Abraham, and thus the genetic lineage of the ancient Israelites, or Hebrews, from whom Christ had been born. Many Reformed Christians began to show less hostility and even extended a hand of friendship towards the Jews, especially with new interpretations of the end times. Jews converting and accepting Christ was a view always held by the Church as a pretext to his return. There was nothing new about this idea. However, many began to think it was possible to accelerate the return of Christ by certain actions and creating the conditions necessary, such as lifting the restrictions previously placed on Jews and allowing them ordinary rights. It was thought that by showing acts of kindness, they would reciprocate and convert to Christianity. Only, they did not. Instead, The Jews used this as a Trojan horse to infiltrate Christianity and subvert the faith. Convincing people from outside of Judaism was the key they needed. The first mention of a Jewish homeland by a Christian that I could find was Thomas Brightman, an English Puritan who wrote the book Shall They Return to Jerusalem Again? In 1615. Convinced of his own divinity in his writing, Brightman, like many, fell for the romanticism of the end times and the apocalypse. A self-ordained and self-proclaimed prophet, Brightman was seduced by eschatology, leading him to the belief that the return of Christ could be ushered in simply by restoring the Jews to the Holy Land. In the early 17th century, there were no Jews in England. They had been expelled over 300 years prior by King Edward I. However, with England split between Protestants and Catholics, a revolutionary entered the scene, raising an army in rebellion against the state under the guise of equality, democracy, and the usual SJW nonsense we hear today. Oliver Cromwell, also a Puritan, led a successful campaign, destroying the monarchy and usurping state power, allowing for Parliament to wrestle control away from King Charles I, ending with his execution. Shortly thereafter, the Jews were back in England, following the petition of Dutch rabbi Manasseh ben Israel. A central bank had been set up, and an ever-increasing number of religious fanatics were appearing, many of whom were fascinated with and preached messianic prophecy. With Christianity in much of Northern Europe becoming heavily Judaized, the gates of restoration were being thrown wide open as the 18th century saw the emergence of a British ruling class that was becoming aligned with Jewish interests, as was the case across the Atlantic, which had become a safe haven for religious fundamentalists. Behind the scenes, and underneath these apocalyptic Christians, were Jews whispering in their ears, using mysticism and persuasive occult practices from Kabbalah to further the advance of resettlement of a Jewish state in Palestine. With momentum continuing in the direction of a Jewish state, it was only a matter of time. Settlement of non-indigenous Jews in Palestine actually began in the late 18th century, financed and facilitated by mainly Hasidic Kabbalistic extremists. So for 2 centuries, before Theodor Herzl even wrote his book, Der Judenstaat, thousands of Jews had already settled in Palestine. The Karlan-Stolen Hasidic dynasty in Russia began in 1736 and was dedicated to the cause. One of its members and Chabad founder, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, was one such settlement builder. Another was Shalom Sharabi, a Jewish Yemenite. Then there were the wealthy banker philanthropists, Judah Toro of early America and Moses Montefiore of Britain. They both built settlements as Jews and for Jews. Montefiore's family, a Mokata goldsmith fame, the most prominent being Jewish agency bigwig Osman Elim Davigdor Goldsmith, has been at the forefront of high finance and settlement building for centuries. Their partners, the Rothschilds, Warburgs, Schiffs, and Arisons, the biggest bankrollers of Jewish colonies, were engaged in such activity because they felt compelled to do so by Judaic duty, and not what came to be known as Zionism. Later there came Moritz Steinschneider, the parasite who coined anti-Semitism and is considered a proto-Zionist, writing about the concept of a Jewish state in 1842, followed by Rabbi Judah Alkali and the Society of the Settlement of Eretz Israel in London, just 10 years later. And then in 1862 there was Moses Hess, who advocated an alliance between secular and Hasidic Jews in order to rebirth Israel, and his book, Rome and Jerusalem, where he explained how Palestine would be taken from the Ottomans and settled with the help of the British Empire and Freemasonry. This is just the tip of the Jewish iceberg, pun intended, with many other names such as Zvi Hirsch Kalischer, Moshe Lieb Lilienblum, Leon Pinsker, and Rabbi Azrael Hildesheimer, all being involved directly or indirectly in the settlement of Palestine in the 19th century, many years before Theodor Herzl, who is simply the poster child of Zionism, part of the PR campaign in gathering support for the creation of a Jewish state. In conclusion, we can ascertain that Zionism is not secular and goes much deeper than 19th century British imperial ambitions, only becoming a possibility once the church had been split and heretical Christians began inventing false theological ideas, which the Jews cleverly fomented, directing them towards the notion of a restored Jewish homeland under the false promise of the return of Christ. As if man can influence God and accelerate his plans in some kind of life hack or cheat code, a clever ruse used to bait Gentiledom into aligning itself with a Hasidic, Kabbalistic, Jewish agenda.